Joining me now is the First Lady of El Paso, but also you're known as the expert when it comes to Tom Lea. You founded the Tom Lea Institute here in El Paso. There's this whole other world when it comes to Tom Lea. I mean, we know him as the artist of the Southwest and as an author, but also he was a correspondent for Life magazine as an artist during World War II.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Well, he was he was working out in El Paso. He'd been doing illustrations for J. Frank Dobie, but he was contacted by a new publication, Life magazine, right in 1941, when the United States was gearing up for war, and they wanted to do. They did a series of articles on gearing up for war, and so they asked Tom Lea, since they'd read a book of his. Dan Longwell, the founding editor, had read a book, seen his illustrations, and wrote him, had a telegram sent that asked him to do a drawing of a cavalry soldier at Fort Bliss. And that was the beginning of a career. It was really a career over the course of World War II, where he traveled over 100,000 miles and became the most noted of war correspondents in over a dozen spreads, like 11 or 12 page spreads with multiple paintings of different actions of war.
And he was actually on an aircraft carrier, did several tours, and talk about some of the artwork that he was doing while he was on those carriers.
Right. Well, he had gone on a destroyer to the North Atlantic right before we entered Pearl Harbor. And then he went to the South Pacific, where he was aboard the USS Hornet, an aircraft carrier, in August for 3 months. And Jimmy Doolittle, most people have heard of Jimmy Doolittle, the raid over Tokyo, his raiders had taken off of the USS Hornet. So the Japanese were after it. And Tom Lea went aboard and spent 3 months documenting kind of daily lives, who the people were. And then he would bring his drawings home and do paintings out of his studio in El Paso. But so when the Hornet was sunk, he was lifted off to present his drawings to Admiral Nimitz at CINCPAC. And when Nimitz is the one who broke the news to him that the Hornet had been sunk, he had observed the torpedoing of another aircraft carrier called the USS Wasp while he was there. And then they lost the Hornet. So, I mean, that was a very iffy time for the United States, because we had no coverage in the South Pacific.
It is so fascinating because he's an artist, and of course his work is beautiful, but it's important because it's history, and you refer to him as a historian covering important parts of history during this time.
Yeah, he did cover history, and there are, many 20th century artists, they create their own worlds. And Tom Lea was always interested, especially when it came to World War II, of accurately reporting things. So you can look at the ships and I mean, he would want a sailor to look at it and say he got it right, and he did. So he was honored several times by the military for his work because of his accuracy and really his love for the men. While he was aboard the Hornet, he was asked to dine with, like, in the mess of from the lowest to the highest, and he was interested in the inner workings of the ship. So he wasn't just kind of sidling up to admirals and people like that. No, he did people sweeping the floors and the people who moved the planes around, and he was an accurate reporter of every part that makes up a whole.
Which is so important.
And he also wrote, this is something that's unusual, I've never read war history that's expressed like this, but he wrote about that Hornet as if it were a living thing. And he talked about its skin of steel, but how it had its children. It had all those planes and that took off from the Hornet, and he wrote about I don't remember all their titles, but how they would watch. They couldn't go to bed till their children got home, till those planes came back and landed, and how there was mourning when a table at the mess was completely empty because a plane had been shot down. So he records it in such human terms, and who these people were, where they came from, He talked about later in China, when he went to China later, how some of those same pilots were in China, and he wanted to see them because he wanted to see the change in their eyes.
Wow.
He'd actually gone to San Antonio to record them when they had first started learning to fly.
It's so
it's a
incredible.
It's a very human approach to war and the people that are there fighting it and what can happen to their lives.
And of course, we can find some of his work here at the El Paso Museum of Art, the Tom Lea Institute, which you helped to find as well. And you have some of those Life magazines also at the Tom Lea Institute if people want to check it out.
We do. And one thing that's very special, and I remember I started representing Tom Lea in 1993, and he had a sketchbook that he had aboard the USS Hornet. And I remember, and there's naval censor stamps on every page. I think we may see it in a minute. Okay. But I remember there was a man from Mississippi who owned a TV station here, and he wanted to buy it. I showed it to him. And I remember telling Tom that this man wanted to buy it. And Tom wasn't a wealthy man, and he asked me at the end of his life to help him sell his work because, you know, there are concerns when you don't have people waiting in line. Most of your friends have passed away. But I remember at the time he said, you know, it's like selling your soul. And he couldn't let it go to a man he didn't know. So I called the chairman of the King Ranch, Jamie Clement. He wrote the history of the King Ranch to see if he would help me. And we got a group of El Pasoans and people across the state to buy it for the El Paso Museum of Art. So that's how it ended up being.
That is outstanding. Well, thank you for joining us. And we're going to have much more on Tom Lea on our website. Go to ktsm.com.